Hello, my lovelies. Ginny O here, the author with no last name. And this is Ginny O Reads, the part of the channel where I read the first chapter of an indie, science fiction, or fantasy book. This week, I'm reading the first chapter of my own book, a fantasy fairy tale retelling, the second book in the Thwarting Expectation series, The Dawn Princess. A bit of housekeeping. Moving forward, I've decided that I'm only going to review 4 or 5 Ginger Snap books. I want to do honest reviews, but sometimes an honest review doesn't help anybody, and I want to give out cookies. This is emotional for me, as it is emotional for the indie authors that might be reading or watching my channel. So until I can find a 4 or 5 Ginger Snap book to read, I still want to provide content to the channel, so I'm going to read my own works, which probably I should be doing anyway, just for some exposure. From the back of the book: a derelict castle, a sleeping princess, a deadly vendetta, the fate of the world. Great destiny shouldn't be like this. Mercenary captain and magician Philippe of the marauding sea wolves company doesn't know whether to praise his luck or curse when he and his retreating people stumble across a derelict castle surrounded by thorns. With magic involved, there is no such thing as coincidence. Running from an evil magician only known as the Emperor, Philippe and his people need a place to hide. What he doesn't need is a princess, pampered, spoiled, and useless. If he wants the castle to hide and protect his people, he's going to have to wake the princess inside. Once awake, Princess Roxana isn't what he expected. Stubborn, proud, and hard-working. Knowing nothing of the current world, Roxana is seeking answers to what has happened while she's been asleep. The people she knows have disappeared. New creatures called centaurs and minotaurs walk the land. The answer appears to be this emperor. Taking on evil magicians is her life's calling. She can't fall in love with a man who's avoiding her. Come spring, even if no one wants her to, she's going to take on this emperor herself. That's a life she understands. Suicide mission? Maybe. The fate of the world and its magic is on the line. If she and Philippe can let go of their pride and love, for once, it's a good thing that Roxana was born a princess. If you'd like to follow along, Chapter 1 of Dawn Princess is on my website, ginny0.wordpress.com. That's Ginny, the number 0.wordpress.com, or is on Amazon and in the Look Inside feature. Link in the description below. Let's get right into it, shall we? Dawn Princess, Chapter 1. The stiff snow crunched and squeaked under the hooves of the restless horses. Clouds of fog formed with every breath they and their riders took. For miles behind them, there had been nothing but the gray trunks of a sleeping forest and slick, ice-covered streams. Captain Philippe, known as Ravager, of the marauding Sea Wolves Mercenary Company, stared at the sight before him. A castle beset by a hedge of thorns. 2 towers barely visible beyond vines as thick as tree trunks, and thorns bigger than swords. Behind that hedge was protection for his people, and all that came after them. Safety was within their grasp, except for that hedge. The hedge didn't rustle. It didn't move. It could barely creak, it was so old, the vines thick and knotted together. The black stallion underneath him shifted on his feet. Philippe put a hand on his neck to settle the stallion. "Easy, Sable," he murmured. Philippe tore his gaze away from the hedge to look into the worried eyes of the chief sorcerer, Raoul. Philippe turned his head away, shivering under the piles of furs and wool doing their best to keep him warm. It wasn't from the chill, despite it being the deepest and most bitter part of winter, but from Raoul's worry. "Make the best camp you can, Chief Lieutenant," he directed over his shoulder to a woman riding a large bay mare. "Aye, Captain." The lieutenant, whose name was Mahout, nodded and turned her horse. She shouted orders. Philippe nudged his stallion closer to the hedge. Raoul followed him. Philippe mused aloud. I wonder if there are walls behind that monstrosity. Raoul snorted. Walls can pin us in, Philippe. They could also keep us safe for a short time. Philippe shifted his weight with the horse's movements. There was a reason your ancestors forsook the land, Raoul warned. Yes, Philippe said, voice dry as the air. It involved a beheading, so the family tales say. Raoul pointed at the hedge. And what do your tales say about that? Philippe shivered again. He'd been hoping the sorcerer would know something, and they wouldn't have to rely on his knowledge of tales and legends when it came to magic. For the hedge had to be magical, but Philippe wasn't willing to lower his carefully constructed shield to look at it. The land's been drained of magic around here for miles, Raoul muttered. We can all feel the lack, Philippe. We should move on. In the dead of winter? Philippe's voice turned harsh. Haven't we lost enough good men, women, and horses to the Emperor's swords and arrows? Must we lose them to frostbite and cold madness as well? We're werewolves, Raoul, not invincible. Then we could turn into wolves. And lose the horses? Philippe glared at him. He pointed at the hedge. This is the first viable shelter we've come across. We can head for the sea. The ships aren't there! Philippe roared. Behind them, the sounds of camp being set up quieted. Raoul pressed his lips together and stared at the hedge, expressionless. The sounds of camp started up again. Philippe tugged a scarf over his mouth. The sea was frozen. The ships couldn't make it close enough to shore for them to board. The winter storms would drive them into ice and rock. This castle was their best hope to rest until spring. Then they could decide on what to do about the Emperor. But they had to get past the hedge. Raoul grimaced and gave in, asking what he didn't want to ask. Do you know anything? It seems somewhat familiar. I'll want to check my notes. Philippe told him and rubbed his thumb. Under the glove, it put pressure on a golden ring. He pressed it, and the metal dug into his flesh. Raoul grumbled. I hope you know what you're doing. Philippe tugged on the reins, turning Sable's head. The stallion turned and walked towards the forming camp. Raoul put his scars over his mouth and gave the hedge a last look of disgust, and followed. Rank had its privileges, and Philippe's rank offered him a bigger tent that was harder to heat, and several extra pack horses which were more expensive to feed. Being a mage as well as a warrior, and as much of a scholar as his people had, Philippe needed the extra horses to carry the gear of both professions. Now, he was grateful he hadn't abandoned the books. He had a feeling that he wouldn't find any mentions of the hedge in his spellbooks, the same basic training that he shared with Raoul. No, it'd be among his books of lore. He hoped he'd brought the right books. The Book of Tales was thick and had been compiled by several writers from oral traditions, folk tales, and songs. Many of the tales were incomplete, or had several versions with notes on not being certain which tale was actually true. Happy endings were scarce, and people in the tales tended to fare badly. Their conditions hidden behind veiled references and platitudes. It wasn't pleasant reading. But every lore scholar swore up and down that there was some truth to the tales, and before the Emperor had driven the Fae underground and hill, the world had been as dangerous as it was now for very different reasons. Of course, the Emperor was blamed for anything horrible, from a bad harvest, unexpected sickness, to the extinction of the dragons. Philippe flipped through the pages by the light of the lamp and wished that lore scholars titled their tales more clearly. There were many tales about following the dictates of the church, which church was left up to interpretation, and a great many tales where perfectly innocent and good people came to a bad end through no fault of their own. Magical talking animals were also present. It was quite late by the time he found the story he was searching for. His eyes ached and felt dry as he rubbed them, his chest hollow with the adrenaline of fatigue. Philippe brought the lamp closer to the book. The tale was titled, The Sleeping Princess. Under the title, the scribe had noted that this tale, or a version of it, had been popular centuries ago, which, given the age of the tale, was long ago indeed. Even kings wished for love matches for their daughters, and strong, wise men to rule after them for their husbands. Heaven forbid that the princess wished to rule well on her own, Philippe mused. The story had fallen quite out of fashion, and the tale spinner hadn't heard of a sleeping princess in their lifetime, and neither had the father or grandfather for several generations back. The tale was incomplete. At her christening, the princess had been cursed to die. No reason had been given as to why, only that she had been cursed. And through luck, and an unused blessing, the curse had been diverted into sleep. The princess grew up, and despite many precautions, the curse of sleep fell anyways. Those around her had also fallen asleep. A hedge of thorns grew up around the castle to protect her from unscrupulous kings and princes. Eventually, a prince of pure heart came, defeated the thorn hedge, and woke the princess in her court. They fell in love, and that was that. There was another note in the margin that this was the most pleasant form of the tale. Philippe wondered for whom it was supposed to be pleasant. He read it several times, but couldn't glean any more information from it. He set the books aside, rubbing his eyes again. He muttered about bards and their inability to give any useful information along with their romantic drivel. The hedge was definitely magical, and if there was some magical or even physical way to defeat it, surely the tale could have noted it. Philippe was afraid that whatever the prince had done to defeat the hedge wasn't written down because the prince had done precisely nothing and had been lucky to be at the hedge at the right time. A pure heart meant nothing to Philippe. How would a hedge know a pure heart from an impure heart anyways? Curses had conditions. Curses always had a loophole, a way out. Except no one thought to write down what that was either. Most likely because at the time, the story had still been so popular everyone knew, and everyone assumed that everyone else knew. He clenched his eyes shut. He had no choice. He was going to have to approach the hedge, and examine it magically. He could do it in the morning. At least now he had some idea of what he would find beyond the hedge. He doused his light, and tried to settle into his bedroll. Morning came far too quickly. After a quick breakfast, while he checked on his horses and the men and women who were his responsibility, Philippe approached the hedge. Rule intercepted him and grabbed his arm. "What are you doing?" Rule hissed. Rule was an old friend, as well as head of the company's mages. Philippe couldn't be captain and head the mages at the same time, thus he allowed Rule certain liberties. Philippe gently removed Rule's hand from his arm. "Examining the hedge," he said gently. Rule looked startled and looked up at the hedge. He took a step back and muttered under his breath. "We talked about this yesterday." Philippe scowled at Rule. "Every time I turn away from this hedge, I forget about it." Rule crossed his arms. "Everyone does. I've heard murmurings in the camp since we've got here. Turn away and turn back, and you're startled it's there. I want to know what it is, even if you'd seen it seconds before. It's cursed, Philippe. I'm sure of it." "I'm sure it's cursed," Philippe said. "That's the point of a thorn hedge. But to constantly forget about it? Our troops are not people with weak minds." Raoul looked like he wanted to spit. "We should leave this place and not come back. Assuming we'd remember it existed." "That's exactly my point." Philippe sighed. Raoul was cranky and stubborn. As a war mage, he'd seen too much, and he'd turned brittle as a result. Philippe had to keep an eye on the bigger picture. The bigger picture told him that they had no place else to go, and more companies in need of shelter on their heels. "I'm going to get in if I can," Philippe told Raoul. Raoul's eyes widened. He shifted his stance. "You can't. You're the captain. Send someone else if you must." Philippe snorted. "And be thought a coward? No, it must be me. Wait until the others arrive and try then. And in a few days we could welcome the others with walls and warm fires and hopefully a roof over our heads," Philippe retorted. "You know something of this," Raoul grumbled. "Enough to be dangerous, little enough to be useless," Philippe told him. "Why must you always be so certain that it is you who must run off into danger? Why am I the firstborn of my father?" Philippe asked, and put his hands on his hips. He looked at the hedge, and uneasiness stirred in him. A sleeping princess with no clear way out. A hedge with no known method of defeat. His forgetting men and women. "You had no thoughts on the matter?" he said to Raoul. "As soon as I entered my tent out of its sight, I forgot about the hedge entirely." Raoul ground his foot into the snow. "Strange that I did not," Philippe murmured. He gripped the handle of his sword. "If you insist on going, at least let me monitor you." Raoul scowled. Philippe pressed his lips together and nodded. Fine, he said, and I think we best write down where I am, lest you forget me too. Less than an hour later, his thumb throbbing from a prick of a silver needle, Philippe faced the hedge again. Behind him, a pack of wolves darted back and forth, pressing against his legs. He put his hand on the head of the nearest. Don't stray too close to the hedge, he warned them. I don't know how intelligent it is, or what it can do. The wolves whined, and each made sure to get close enough for a nudge or a pat before dispersing around the hedge. Mahout and Raoul looked at him. Raoul held aloft a pendant that glowed a silvery blue in the shadows of the hedge. Raoul nodded at him. They were as prepared as they could be given what scant information they had. Mahout cracked a grin. Well, Captain, never thought of you as a prince before. I'm not a prince, Philippe grumbled. But you'd make a good one, given your ancestry and all. Mahout snickered, her eyes crinkling. My ancestry is rumors and gossip, Philippe grumbled. He hadn't told them about the sleeping princess inside the castle, only that a prince was needed to get inside, and once inside he could break the curse. This had amused all the soldiers that had heard, and word had spread quickly through the ranks, bringing up the old stories that his families had once been royalty long ago of a country that no one knew the name of. Philippe didn't know if the stories were true. The only credence they had was a family heirloom passed down from father to firstborn son for generations. A ring with a crest on it. A ring so old and so worn it was difficult to determine what the crest was. Only that it was important, and not the reason why, remained. Their people had no land. They owed no country their allegiance. They may long for the land, but the land was a trap. Philippe shivered again, like they'd been trapped fighting the Emperor's armies, forced into a retreat, forced to run deeper inland, and further away from the lands they did know. They were well into uncharted territory. This could be their last hope of refuge. What was further out than this? They had a great deal of nothing but wilderness behind them, and Philippe held no hope for anything but a great deal of nothing but wilderness in front of them. So he must defeat this hedge and gain the castle. He took a deep breath, steeled his courage, and stepped closer to the hedge. It moved. Philippe stopped. Raoul cursed and stepped back. Mahout put a hand on her sword. Philippe dropped his carefully constructed shields. The magic of the hedge beat at him. Cacophony of spells. Sleep, sleep, the strongest crooned. There's nothing here, the next whispered. I'm not important. Forget, forget. Go about your business as if nothing happened. You never notice me. It was an insidious, constant stream of whispers and murmurs. Philippe pushed past it. Come closer, the hedge hissed. I'll crush you, stab you, hang you to die until your bones fall to the floor and tangle in my vines. The last was like bells. If you're unworthy, you shall not pass. Philippe studied it carefully. The hedge wanted to kill him. It was the guard dog at the gate. That was its function, to keep the sleeping princess safe by killing those that tried to enter. The forgetfulness curse, the low insidious whispering, was something he'd like to study and duplicate into a spell. It could be useful, but he saw its weakness immediately. If he thought for a second the castle and the hedge were unimportant, he'd forget them. If he knew they were important, personally important to him, then he would retain the memories. It had nothing to do with being weak-minded. The sleep spell was passive, and couldn't affect him as he was aware of its existence and could guard against it. Only those taken unawares, or those who surrendered to it, would fall asleep. But it was the bell-like tone that interested him most. If he was worthy, he could pass the hedge. But how did he prove he was worthy? Or was this some sort of test? He took another step forward, his mind racing. Magic swirled around him, freezing him to the spot. His hairs on his arms stood up, and he tingled all over. This wasn't the tame and controlled magic he knew. It was the same bell-like magic that warned him about being worthy. Wild like bubbles, or being in a rushing stream, or caught in a ripped tide. It rustled in his ears. Prove you're worthy, it sang. Prove you're worthy. What did he have to do? Frustration filled him and he clenched his fist. But his gut told him that if he asked the wild magic that question, it would deem him a failure and leave him to the fate promised by the hedge. Philippe examined the hedge again. What had he compared it to? A guard dog? It was only doing its job. Sure, it was a wild dog, undisciplined and untamed, neglected by its owner, that would kill anyone who got too close. But that wasn't the hedge's fault. It was the fault of whoever had set it to the task. And the hedge was old, far older than any magical hedge had the right to be. There was no doubt in Philippe's mind that it was alive and intelligent. A twisted sort of intelligence, but intelligent. Wild magic, intelligent plants, this reeked of things and magic beyond his understanding, of times before the Emperor. It made the animal part of him, the wolf, who had much more sense than the rest of Philippe, very frightened indeed. This hedge wasn't a wolf problem. This hedge was a guard dog. And what did you do with dogs? One commanded them. One didn't ask, not with as wild as a guard as this was. One didn't ask, not with as wild of a guard as this, for it'd be seen as weakness. He must be respectful of the hedge's power, but firm that it must let him pass. He must show no fear. Philippe gathered his courage. It was a plant, a dangerous plant, but he'd seen too much and done too much to be frightened by a plant. Sure, it was threatening to kill him in an agonizingly slow fashion. Death was a kindness, mercy, even a slow death compared to the things he'd seen. He took his hand off his sword and took another step forward. The hedge stopped moving, and to Philippe's magical senses, it almost felt as if the hedge was listening. Philippe stepped closer until if he reached out his arm he could touch the hedge. Before he could feel foolish for addressing a plant, he cleared his throat and squared his shoulders. I have business inside this castle, and you shall let me pass. He filled his voice with stern command. The hedge quivered. Philippe took a step forward, keeping his thoughts filled with purpose. He had people depending on him. No hedge was going to keep him from his purpose. If the hedge allowed him to pass, it would be rewarded by being able to rest. The hedge groaned. The vines moved, creaking and snapping as they pulled back to form an indent as large and wide as he was. Philippe didn't dare and couldn't hesitate. He stepped into the indent and kept walking. The vines were so thick that there were no spaces between them, forming crude walls as he walked. Mahout looked at Rule. You know, I was joking about the prince thing, she said. Maybe I was wrong. Philippe heard the vines snap and creak behind him. He didn't dare look over his shoulder, but he was certain there was no way back. He walked, as straight as he could, forward in the dark, his boots rustling in the debris of old leaves. The dark doesn't scare me, hedge, he said to it. There are worse things than the dark. The hedge rustled in response, and as if the darkness had been a ploy to test its courage all along, the vines above him drew back enough to let small bits of light through, so he could see the tunnel opening before him. And now that he could see where he was going, he realized that as he'd been following the noise of the hedge opening in front of him in the dark, he hadn't actually been walking in a straight line at all. The path ahead of him was slightly curved. Philippe stopped. Don't toy with me, hedge. The hedge rustled as if insulted. It dropped something on his head. Look what I can do. It hissed and rustled magically. Philippe reached up and grabbed it. A skull of a bird or a rodent stared back at him. He dropped it. Old bones don't scare me either. Above him, the vines creaked and groaned at him in annoyance. Ahead of him, the tunnel opened further, offering more light, as if coaxing him forward. Philippe didn't need to be coaxed. He strode forward again. The vines to the side of him formed grotesque shapes and rattled. Philippe ignored them. If anything, he was starting to become amused. Yes, he was certain the hedge could kill him with little fuss, but the way it tried to scare him reminded him of the games he and his siblings would play as children. Ahead of him, the light brightened, and he could feel a fresh breeze on his exposed face. He quickened his pace again, and walked out of the other side of the hedge a whole man. The vine snapped shut behind him. Ahead of him was a wall, and in the wall was a door. a huge door left slightly ajar. Philippe leaned his head back in restrained whistle. The wall was at least 2 stories high, had a rampart which made it even taller. Set in a gatehouse, the door itself was its point a story and a half and cut down the middle. It was meant to be opened by use of a pulley and chain system. Philippe rubbed his boot over metal grooves set into what remained of an old road, grooves filled with dirt and small pebbles. There was no way he was going to fit through a gap in the doors, and also no way as a human he could pry them open. Fortunately, Philippe wasn't human. He loosened his belt and unbuckled the straps on the edge of his armor. Throwing his cloak back, Philippe took off his gloves and narrowed his eyes. He called upon his beast, his wolf, and became a monster. The pain came first, then the itching. His joints popped, and his bones lengthened. Fur sprouted all over his body. His nails turned into sharp claws. His ears moved and became like a dog's. And lastly, his jaw lengthened into a muzzle. His nose, now at the tip of it, and like a dog's rather than a human. He was almost a full story tall now himself. If a wolf walked on 2 legs and could have the upper body movement of a human, that is what he looked like. Wolfman, werewolf, loup-garou in the old tongues. He flexed his hands and winced at the cramped feeling of his 2 long feet in his boots. Fur covered his fingers, and the ring was thinner now, but still around his thumb. Magically enchanted into the metal centuries ago was a spell to let the ring change size with him. He grabbed the edge of the door and heaved it towards him, grunting. The hedge swayed, the vines crashing together with great smacks of wood. The door inched forward. Philippe's long tongue flopped out of his muzzle. His shoulders bunched, and he tugged on the door using his superior strength to clear out the grooves, swinging it back and forth. Dirt pushed out of the grooves and piled to either side of them. Inch by inch, the door opened. At least there was enough room for Philippe to pass, and he let the door go, panting. He shook his body, fluffing his fur, and stepped inside into a long tunnel. He glanced up. Holes filled the ceiling. Murder holes. Furious at being thwarted, the vines grabbed the door and slammed it shut behind Philippe. Blackbirds rose from the hedge, cawing their cries of doom. Philippe smoothed his fur and shrunk back to a normal man. He tightened his armor, put his gloves back on, and wiggled his toes to try and relieve the cramps. He looked behind him where the door was, even if he couldn't see it in the dark. He laughed once. He walked down the tunnel where his sensitive wolf eyes had told him there was light. He'd made it through. End Chapter 1. Tell me, my lovelies, would you continue reading? Enjoy listening to me read books? Hit that like or subscribe button. If you have a book you want me to read or review, leave me a comment with a buy link or go to my website and get in contact with me there at ginny0.wordpress.com. That's Ginny, the number 0.wordpress.com. Speaking of my website, that's where you can find information about me and my science fantasy and fantasy books featuring lots of happy werewolf hijinks and people finding their places in the world. My books are available on Amazon and are enrolled in Kindle Unlimited. You can also find me on Twitter at Ginny0. And hey, it's Indie April. Head on over to Twitter, search the hashtag, and find lots of indie books to try out. Next time, my lovelies, I hope I have found a book to review that is either 4 or 5 ginger snaps. See you in the next video.